Welcome to the ILO's Facebook Live discussion coming to you from the Palais des Nations in Geneva as we open the 106th session of the International Labour Conference. This is the first discussion in a two-week series that will highlight key issues in the world of work and are being addressed by over 5,000 delegates from the Ministries of Labour, representative workers and employers from 187 countries. Our premier discussion today will be on decent work and climate change. My guests are Moustapha Kamal, welcome.
Thank you.
And Claire Harasty. Very good. Claire, Moustapha, thanks very much. We're going to have a light conversation kind of about the general aspects of what the ILO is doing. And as our Director General has stated this morning in the conversation, is that the ILO, even though established under the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, it was mandated to promote social justice, not so much on the environmental issues, but obviously throughout the years, environmental issues have been a concern to our workers and employers. We are now looking at a wellspring of support on environmental issues. We've seen that initially in 1992 during the Agenda 21, which came out of the UN's Conference on Environment and Development. And recently in 2015, we have the UN's Sustainable Development Agenda, the SDGs, as well as the Paris Agreement. So with that, I would like to kind of dive right into the ILO Director General's initiative. So on the 100th anniversary, the Director General mentioned the Green Initiative, which will be one of our sort of flagship initiatives leading up to the anniversary. We talk about green jobs. Tell me, Kamal, Moustapha, what does green jobs mean?
Well, simply defined, green jobs are decent work that we have in all economic sectors, in agriculture, in industry, in the service sector as well. But these are jobs that help address some of the environmental challenges that we face, whether it's about minimizing waste, fighting against pollution, or building back the natural capital stock.
Right. And when you say decent work, I mean let's sort of break that down for our viewing audience, because they're not the specialists that you and Claire are, and just hold a bit closer to your mouth so they can hear you clearly. So what is decent work?
Well, decent work is about jobs that are productive, jobs that offer security, social security for workers. They should allow social dialogue to happen, and they should provide for fundamental rights at work. So it's essentially what we're doing, promoting decent work, but looking at environmental opportunities in the environmental sector.
Right. So green jobs comes out of that larger issue of the sustainability, that transition from high carbon to low carbon economies. You know, talk a little bit about what the ILO is doing and how it's supporting its partners, the governments, workers and employers, to achieve that goal.
Well, our work is essentially around 4 points. The first one is enhancing the understanding of how environmental change and the responses to environmental change from policy impact on the world of work. So we do that through assessments, national, global level. Second, we work on the policy side. How can governments and social partners transfer that knowledge into policies, and then building the capacity of our constituents. And finally, doing all of this is through social dialogue, which is essential for any of these actions to work.
So Claire, you're the Senior Development and Policy Specialist at the and Employment Policy Specialist. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about these policies that Moustapha has alluded to. Can you give me some examples about ILO policy and how they're implemented by our constituents?
Right. There's a range of policies, and our tripartite constituents, so the governments, employers and workers, have adopted some guidelines to help them achieve a just transition to a low-carbon economy. And in those guidelines, there are a range of policy themes that are underlined, of which there are labor market policies, social protection policies, economic sectoral policies, etc., etc. I can give you a few.
Please, if you, like, for example, you mentioned the labor market policy. What would an example of that be?
Okay, we know that the green transition will have different impacts on jobs. Some jobs will be destroyed, some others will be created, newly created, some others will have to adapt. And we need labor market policies to help workers and enterprises go through this transition. Workers will need to get new skills, new competencies. Enterprises might need help to start new businesses or hire new talents. So labor market policies deal with these issues through a number of instruments. There are 5 broad instruments. The first one is vocational training. The second one is on job subsidies, wage subsidies to help hiring. The third one is about public employment programs. The fourth one is incentives for entrepreneurship. And the last one is about job counseling, intermediation services to reconcile labor demand and labor supply.
So when you talk about sectors, maybe give me an example of a particular sector and what, for example, a developing country is doing, because we do see differences between developing and developed countries in terms of their responses to these issues. So if you can talk a bit about that.
Well, the issues are sometimes similar between developed and developing economies, but in developing economies, typically the transition offers great opportunities because there's so much left to build. So if you take a city in a developing country, for example, the waste management sector is a huge opportunity to, at the same time, create decent jobs and move towards a cleaner, greener economy in a city. In rural areas of developing countries, agriculture is a huge opportunity because there some new farming techniques can help farmers grow food in a more climate resilient manner. But of course we need policies to accompany this. This will not happen by miracle. They need training, they need some support, either through entrepreneurship support or some subsidies. All public employment programs are very, very efficient in rural areas of developing countries to build the needed infrastructure in a green, ecological way.
You're joining us here today at the Palais des Nations on the opening of the 106th session of the International Labour Conference. My guests today are Claire Harasty, the Senior Development and Employment Policy Specialist, and Moustapha Kamal, who is the coordinator of the Green Jobs Program. You talked about agriculture and about retraining in agriculture. Now, aren't we worried that some of the new technological developments are going to put many people out of work, like for example in Africa, where there's very labor-intensive techniques being used? I mean, how are we looking at the opposite side, or the negative externalities that we don't expect?
In fact, research has shown that in agriculture in Africa, there is a potential to create many, many jobs. Up to 200 million jobs could still be created in a climate resilient type of agriculture. And in fact, if you look at demographic trends in Africa, in the next 20, 30 years, millions of young people will enter the labor market in rural areas, and these people cannot all move to cities in Africa. This will not be sustainable. On the other hand, if one invests in some climate resilient agricultural techniques that save water, that use less pesticides, that are ecological, there is a potential to create many, many jobs, to grow enough food for this population, because the population is still growing in Africa, they need to be fed, and to do this in decent working conditions. And we firmly believe that this is a true opportunity for Africa. It can be a revolution that needs to be accompanied by the right policies, and that's what the ILO is trying to help countries do in Africa.
Very good. We have a question coming in from Jeff, and he's asking about how do young people prepare for green jobs for the future? So, Moustapha, as the youngest guy on the panel here, can you talk a little bit about how young people are preparing for the transition to a low-carbon economy?
I look like a young guy. But, well, I think what Claire said about the demographic dividend is true for Africa, but many other parts of the world. But where we feel challenges is often first that the young people that come into the labor market don't necessarily think about these opportunities in the green industry, in environmental goods and services. So first effort is to raise that awareness, to make them understand that there are many opportunities as the economy is changing. But then second, they often lack the skills to enter in these new occupations. So that means training in vocational education systems can play a role. But then third, and very important, we think that entrepreneurship promotion can be a major driver for job creation. So many of these young people will tend to go into public service and look for jobs as they usually do. But we think that enterprise promotion in the environmental goods and services industries would be a major opportunity for young people to seize.
This sounds like a rather pricey transition. How are we going to absorb those costs? How are we going to generate the funds that are necessary for the training, for the phasing out of old technologies, for the introduction of new technologies? Who's paying the price tag?
Well, of course, here there is a role for government to put in place the enabling conditions, but it's not only governments, it's about social partners as well. We have seen trade unions have training programs of their own, training their members. We have seen enterprises provide funding, subsidies, or even their own investments in training their own workforce, or in some of our programs we have private sector companies willing to put money into a green job incubator in Senegal, where we're working, because they see the potential.
Now, you've mentioned Senegal. Tell me specifically, what are you doing in Senegal?
Well, one of the things that we're doing is to set up an incubator that will promote enterprise development in a few sectors: agriculture, energy, and this is meant to be a partnership where we're trying to rally government, different parts of government, environment, labor, but also private companies, because the ILO is now working on public-private partnership modalities, and there we have companies that have negative impact on the environment, that want to take remediation actions and are willing to invest in programs that could, as part of their corporate social and environmental responsibility, contribute to addressing that challenge. And there are others who just see the business case, that see the opportunities, and they want to invest in those sectors.
So let's push on that for a bit. A lot of this has to be adopted by the private sector. There has to be incentives in place for that. I mean, what do labor market policies actually do in this context? And do they matter?
They do matter, very much so. I don't think the private sector can do that alone. I mentioned earlier that one of the main instruments of labor market policies is incentives for entrepreneurship. So just to follow up on what Kamal was saying, typically these consist of a package of training for young entrepreneurs and access to microcredit to help them start their business. And these packages are really meant to help either new graduates, young people, or unemployed who want to enter these new sectors to start their own business. So this is the idea, and it works well in countries where the private sector is underdeveloped and needs help to grow, as Kamal was saying. But I think there are other actors that are very important too, and I think there is a role for public policies, and I mentioned earlier public employment programs. I think in low-income countries, these public employment programs are very effective in either mitigating the impact of climate change or adapting to climate change. So I would say it should be a partnership, really. And as Kamal said, it's enterprises, of course, but it's also governments that need to play their role in pushing for this transition and giving the right incentives to transit to a green economy.
To our viewers today, we are speaking to you from the Palais des Nations in Geneva. This is the first day of the International Labour Conference, where green jobs is squarely on the agenda. I'd like to go to the questions coming in from our viewers far and wide. Paula has a question today, and I'll go back to you at this point, and then Kamal, Moustapha, if you can join in on that. Paula wants to know, how can you convince the skeptics that moving towards a more sustainable footing is worth the cost?
How to convince the skeptics?
There are sunset industries, right? So some people are afraid of losing their way of
course,
life.
of course.
How do we convince them that this is in their interests over the longer term?
I think this is where the role of public policies becomes important to really smoothen the transition. There will be costs associated. This is there's no question about this. But these costs can be softened by some measures. I want to take the example of China, what they're doing at the moment. They're really entering a huge transition from carbon sectors to non-carbon sectors. So closing steel plants and coal mines, going into renewable energy production. So they're dismissing millions of coal miners, but they're not just leaving them out there. They're providing them with retraining So there are massive investment. The ministry in charge of employment is dealing with this in China. Massive investment in retraining for these workers so that they can be re-employed in new emerging sectors. And this is key, of course. And at the same time, the government of China is also investing a lot in developing the private sector to go into the renewable sector. So they have business incubators for startups. They have these training programs with access to finance, facilitated access to finance, specific subsidies to facilitate hiring by small firms. Small firms have difficulties hiring talents. Talents are expensive and often need to be trained still, even though they're new graduates with very high skill. They still need some retraining, so the employers need some help. So job subsidies can help them hire this new talent and train them until they become fully productive and really deliver on their job. So that's what China is doing. So yes, they see the cost, but the government is ready to invest to help all those affected to transit to some better conditions.
So as you were saying earlier, it's that public-private partnership that's really quite essential to the success of this transition.
Yes, I think so.
Good. Moustapha, sorry, I keep on focusing on the policy side. I want to get down to the more granular level with you. And so is that, we've got 45 million people entering the job market every year. Is everybody going to have a decent job in this new green economy?
Well, that is the ambition, that you trigger an engine of job creation. And if you just look at statistics of what the IVA has done, we find that a decisive move to a low-carbon economy has the potential to create up to 60 million jobs by 2030. And so it does not mean that the 40 million or so entering the labor market will immediately be in those energy service companies or green architecture, but there's a huge potential for many of them. But there must be those policies that we spoke about, and I think for the skeptics, my point would be that often when faced with challenges of the scale that we see, inaction is the worst case choice that you can have.
And with that, I mean, what is your message to the governments that are gathered here today, the 187 members of the ILO? What is the big message you want them to hear on green jobs?
Well, I think the message is just what the Director General has put in his report, that the shift to a low-carbon economy offers opportunities for decent work. Inaction is not an option because we've seen how environmental change and climate change is already damaging business infrastructure, destroying jobs on a scale we haven't seen before, and that there are policies to make this job dividend happen, and governments have to be on the driver's seat.
To our viewers who are just joining us, we are coming to you live from the Palais des Nations in Geneva. The International Labour Organization, the UN specialized agency mandated with the world of work, is starting its 106th Labour Conference, and one of the main items on the agenda is green jobs. I would like to ask Claire, in terms of your work, what are the one or two initiatives that are starting to come out that you feel very excited about? What are the one or two that hold the most opportunity to make that transition and to really prove to those who see that climate change may be nothing more than an overhype of a PR campaign of some sort? What is your message to the world out there?
We increasingly see countries adopting national employment policy frameworks that include measures for the promotion of green jobs or sustainable enterprises. One very interesting example, recent one, is the adoption of the Green Jobs Act in the Philippines, where for the first time a country has legislated on the need to have interministerial coordination to promote green jobs throughout the economy, all sectors. And this is really encouraging to see a government adopting such a strong instrument with very detailed guidance for the government and the private sector to act. We see this happening in other countries, not at such a high level of a legislation, but policy frameworks such as Namibia or Mauritius, Sri Lanka. Other countries are adopting these policies which are based on a tripartite consensus, so the workers, the employers and the government agreeing on a common platform to promote green jobs in their country.
Now, you mentioned a term, sustainable enterprises. Now, for all of us who are not technical specialists, what does because a business person thinks that a sustainable enterprise is one that keeps on generating profits year over year. What is a sustainable enterprise?
Yes, in the ILO sense, of course, it's an enterprise that keeps alive, so that generates profit, but it's also an enterprise that has a social face in terms of the working conditions offered to its workforce, as well as now increasingly entering the green sectors or being eco-responsible itself. So not having a strong imprint, carbon imprint itself. So the ILO, for example, is greening its activities by taking several measures to have less impact on the environment. So I don't know, Kamal, if you want to add something on this.
No, I think that's what you said, that companies increasingly have to look at the bottom line, that their responsibility towards society is not just to their shareholders to generate profits, that they have a responsibility towards societal goals in countries, societies where they operate, but also vis-a-vis the environment, which is, just look at it very simply, it's the basis for production. The clean air we breathe, the fertile soil that we have, the clean water, the forest, these are the basis of economic activity, and every enterprise has a role to play in making them sustainable over time.
In terms of your work in the Green Jobs Program, how are you interfacing with the wider UN system? We know that the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. We know that we have the protection of the environment, both below the sea and on land. How are you working with other UN agencies to realize the goals of the Green Jobs Promise?
Well, we start with our mandate, promoting social justice, but knowing that the environmental sustainability agenda requires that we collaborate with other United Nations agencies. We work with the Climate Change Secretariat, the UNFCCC. We work with UN Environment, with FAO, and we have a number of programs. Joint program, one we have bringing together 5 UN agencies is on the green economy, the Partnership for Action on the Green Economy, where the ILO, together with UN Environment, UNDP, UNIDO, and UNITAR, are working with a dozen countries around the world and helping with our respective mandates address different dimensions of sustainable development.
Right. Now, you've mentioned a term, green economy. You know, we've talked about green jobs, and you've given that definition. Let me push you a bit. What is the green economy, the blue economy? What are we talking about here?
Well, I think this concept, the circular economy, the green economy, they're all about recognizing the need to have a new economic paradigm, one that recognizes that economic growth cannot be pursued at the cost of social and environmental degradation, but on the other hand, sustainable policies that recognize that you can promote energy through clean sources of access, sustainable ways of farming, can deliver strong economic growth, but also address the 2 other important dimensions of sustainable development, which is social development and environmental sustainability.
Right, yes, the 3 pillars of development that had come out of the social summit way back in 1995
Exactly.
are a very, very important part, certainly for the ILO and certainly of the work that we do and interfacing with the UN. For our viewers out there, you are joining us here live at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. This is the opening day of the 106th session of the International Labour Conference. My guests today are Claire Harasty, the Senior Development and Employment Policy Specialist, and Moustapha Kamal, the coordinator of our Green Jobs Program and Enterprises. Claire, I wanted to ask you a bit about the policies that are developing. I mean, what aren't we looking at right now that you would like to see the ILO start to move in a direction? Because sometimes we think we've got it all figured out, but there are some areas that may be a little bit too sensitive to move into. What are the areas looking over the horizon that we'll really have to keep an eye on?
I think at the moment we focus a lot on labor protection, and labor market policies do that as well, so protecting labor, but maybe we should look more at the opportunities out there and look at how some sectoral development policies can really have an impact on decent work. And just to give you an example, I mean, before I mentioned the potential of agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, if we look at where the demographics are and where the resources are, rural areas are the future of Africa. And as ILO, we should maybe invest more in looking at, okay, what type of agricultural policies would promote decent work? What can the world of work do to promote decent work in rural areas in Africa and help all these young people who will enter the labor market there to get good, decent conditions that will keep them also in these rural areas and will help them feed their continent.
Right, and when you talk about Africa, for example, I had noticed that in some earlier discussions we spoke about, for example, that in developing countries or developed countries, the residual architecture provides a wonderful opportunity for retrofitting buildings with lead technologies to sort of take advantage of the new developments and the lowering of the cost, for example, of solar cells. So where does Africa have the advantage beyond agriculture? Is it in transportation? Is it in a number of other areas? What is your thoughts on that?
I see the main sectors where there is potential as agriculture, as we said, of course, transport. The third one would be building, construction, so buildings that are ecological and that would help keep the heat out. And in waste management, very much so, because the cities are becoming huge and the management of waste hasn't followed the big urbanization movement. So waste management is also an area where there are a lot of micro, informal workers dealing with that, and the transition to formality then would be easier for them if there was some policy to manage waste in a different way.
Very good. I have a question coming in from Fatima, and she's asking how can we ensure that the most vulnerable segments of developing countries can benefit from green jobs, and she's pointing specifically to migrant workers in the fisheries sector. Now, as you may know, that in New York today also starts the Oceans Conference, which is mainly focused on environmental sustainability. Our big message is that the ocean is a workplace as well too. What prescriptions do you have in the Green Jobs program to look after the fisheries section?
Well, fishery is a very important sector for many countries. A few years back, UN Environment put a report that indicated that 50 million jobs were at risk in the fishery industry in West Africa. And it's just because of overfishing. There's an excessive fishing capacity. Today there are over 4 million fishing vessels that operate around the world. This is more than twice the capacity we need for sustainable fishing effort. But that means deconstructing this excessive capacity requires a number of policies. How do you absorb the redundant workers into other sectors? How do you pay for trapping policies like the European Union is paying? But this might be difficult for poor countries to pursue. So it's a number of elements, but this is indeed a very important sector for many parts of the world, for Fiji, the Caribbean, and many other regions of the world.
Right, so there are lessons to be learned in all of these areas. And are we doing enough to kind of share that knowledge?
Yes, we do. We, in our work, the program I mentioned earlier, this joint program on the green economy, where we have a global academy on the green economy that takes place every other year at the International Training Center of the ILO in Turin, and where we have close to 200 delegates that come from all over the world, sharing experiences. We have knowledge fairs. We also have policy level dialogues. We have a ministerial conference of PAGE that takes place every other year, where you elevate that dialogue among ministers, but it's all about sharing experience and policies.
Great. Well, we have a number of questions which I'm afraid I'm unable to get to today because our time is coming to a close. I'd like to leave you with, to ask you one last question, and I'm going to give you the beginning of a sentence. I want you to complete it within 3 seconds. So, decent work and environmental concerns are?
They're very much interlinked.
Claire?
They are the future.
Well, thank you very much. My guests today have been Moustapha Kamal, the coordinator of the Green Jobs Program for the ILO, and Claire Harasty, who is the Senior Development Employment Specialist at the ILO. I want to thank you very much. For all the viewers out there today, please stay tuned. We are going to be coming to you for the next 2 weeks with a series of issues that are being addressed by the 187 member states of the ILO here at the Palais des Nations. My name is Kevin Cassidy. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Oh, no, it's the same.